Hi, everybody. My name is Paige Thurston. I'm here from Living Lakes, Canada. Again, so grateful to be here tonight on Ktunaxa territory. I'd also like to acknowledge that the work of Living Lakes Canada takes place on the lands and territories of Indigenous peoples and First Nations from coast to coast. We recognize the role and responsibility that these peoples have to their land and to the water, and we seek to uplift their voices through water stewardship. So Living Lakes Canada is a water science and stewardship NGO with more than 20 years of experience working with communities, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to protect fresh water. A focus of our work is on community-based water monitoring and data sharing. Beginning in 2017, we led the development of the Columbia Basin Waterhub open source database. So today we'll be exploring the topic of open and accessible data as it relates to freshwater stewardship. So starting at the beginning here, what is open data? Open data is defined by the Open Knowledge Foundation as data that can be freely used, reused, and redistributed, subject only at most to the requirement to attribute and share alike, and we'll talk about that later on here. So why is open data so important for water stewardship? Here in the Elk Valley and across the Columbia Basin, we are so lucky to have a wide variety of water monitoring and stewardship initiatives that are collecting great data. But the process of moving from data collection to seeing that data actually be used for decision-making can be difficult. And this is where open data can play an important role. When we share our data on an open platform, it becomes available to be accessed and used by others. And while data is often collected for a specific purpose, in many cases, it can be useful for other initiatives or studies outside of that original intent. Additionally, if data is not shared openly, we don't always know who's monitoring what and where, and this can lead to duplication of efforts as well as limiting opportunities for collaboration and synergy. Sharing data openly can allow for increased transparency, accountability, and trust between government, industry, and the public. And lastly, if data is just held in internal filing systems or on private computers, there's a risk of that data being lost. So sharing data on an external platform can serve as a way to ensure that the data is archived and available for future use, which is increasingly important with climate change and wanting to look at trends over time and understand how things are changing. So open data allows for increased access, collaboration, transparency, and preservation of data. And all of this is integral in supporting better water stewardship and management, which is usually the ultimate goal of a water monitoring initiative. So with all of these great benefits to open data, it is important to be aware that there are some considerations to take, and there are some types of data which should not always be shared openly or require some additional care before they get shared. So the first of those is data or knowledge that is held by or pertaining to Indigenous peoples or First Nations. We've got several frameworks that help us to understand how we can work respectfully with this type of information. The first of those is the CARE data principles for Indigenous data governance. These are international guidelines that provide a framework for the application and use of Indigenous data and Indigenous knowledge. And CARE stands for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. Additionally, here in Canada, the First Nations Information Governance Centre has created a set of principles which pertain specifically to First Nations, called the First Nations Principles of OCAP, which stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession. And both of these are really important guidelines for us all to be aware of and to respect in our work with data. A couple of other situations where you might want to take some additional consideration before sharing your data openly. The first of those being data that contains personal or confidential information about individuals. The next one, which might be more applicable to our environmental work here, is to consider whether sharing that data could put an ecosystem at risk, so making specific locations public for things like nesting sites or a sighting of a rare bird or a plant could have unintended consequences if it attracts people to that site. And lastly, if you've got valuable equipment out in the field or you've got concerns about vandalism, you might not want to share the exact location of your monitoring site. So in both of these locations, or both of these situations, it's not that the data can't be shared, but just that we need to take some additional consideration before sharing it publicly. So now that we understand why data sharing is important and what to consider before sharing, how do we share our data in the most effective way possible? In 2016, the FAIR data principles were published, which provide us with best practices and guidelines for data management and sharing. And firstly, the data should be findable. So this means sharing your data in a platform and in a way that others can find it, whether they be people or machines or computers. Secondly, that data needs to be accessible, ideally through an open access platform, removing barriers for anyone seeking to retrieve and use that data. Thirdly, data should be interoperable, so allowing integration with other data sources, programs, and systems. So an example of this would be sharing your data using an open file format rather than a proprietary format that someone can only open if they have a specific computer program. And finally, data needs to be reusable for future research and analysis. And to do that, it's necessary to have clear documentation, licenses, and permissions to allow others to use that data. So these are some good guidelines to consider when sharing data. And one thing I will note here, looking back to those CARE principles and the First Nations principles of OCAP, these can also align with the FAIR data principles. They can work in tandem, and it is possible to share data in a way that aligns with all of these principles. I just wanted to touch quickly on the concept of accessibility. So often when we approach an entity that is collecting water data and we request that they make it available openly, they will respond to us that they already published their data in an annual report, or maybe they published their lab results as PDFs on their website. And this is where we make a bit of a distinction between the data being available and actually being accessible. So as an example here on the left, we've got a chart from a report by the Elk River Alliance. And this is a great chart. It provides us with some interpretation of the data. We can quickly look at it. We learn something about conductivity in streams in the Elk Valley. So this chart has value. But if it was just this chart alone, it would be very difficult for somebody else to come along and use that data for another purpose. The same is true of sharing things like PDFs of lab results. There's some extra work involved for the user to convert that to a usable format. But luckily for us in this situation, in addition to creating these great reports, the Elk River Alliance also shares all of their water data on the Columbia Basin Waterhub in an accessible format. So we've really got the best of both worlds here. On the right-hand side, you can see that they've got their data from Alexander Creek in a CSV file, which can easily be used for future analysis. So thumbs up. And this is something to consider if you're thinking about sharing data, or if you're already sharing data. Are you actually making it accessible and able to be used to its fullest potential? Coming back to that concept of reusability, I just wanted to touch on licensing. So sometimes there is a hesitancy to share data openly due to concerns about how that data may be used by a third party, and licensing can be a very useful tool here. So open data doesn't necessarily mean that anybody is free to use the data however they want. Licensing offers us the means to dictate usage parameters, so we can specify that data is for non-commercial usage only. We could require that the data owner be recognized and cited for their work, and we can require that the products created from the data are also shared openly. If you are using open data, this is also a reminder to become familiar with the terms of the license that data was shared under, and be sure that you're adhering to those terms in your use of the data. Looking more specifically here now at the Columbia Basin Waterhub, recognizing the need for a central place to store and access data in the Columbia Basin, Living Lakes began the development of the Columbia Basin Waterhub in 2017. Our database now hosts nearly 400 datasets from more than 50 contributing organizations across the region. We offer personalized one-to-one support on data management and sharing, and because we take this individualized approach and provide that support for each of our users, we've actually seen an increase in the quality of data collection and data management practices across our users over time, which is fantastic to see. And the Waterhub was designed to be simple and easy to use and support the unique needs and preferences of a wide range of contributors. We also offer customized profiles for each of our contributors, so the Waterhub serves as a showcase of all of the amazing organizations that are collecting and sharing data in the basin. I'm happy to share that we were recently awarded an Open Data Quality Award from the Canadian Open Data Society. So looking at some of the positive outcomes that have come from sharing data on the Waterhub, we are aware that provincial decision makers and provincial hydrologists have used data from the Waterhub to support their own research and analysis, and that it is a resource that they look to when making decisions about water, which is fantastic to hear. That's exactly what we all want to happen with our data, is to see it used for decision making. Additionally, the Pacific Salmon Foundation recently used the water temperature datasets from the Waterhub to inform their development of a province-wide salmon habitat model, and that includes many datasets that were collected here in the Elk Valley by the ERA and others. Recently, we love to work with youth and with students, so we worked with data analysis students at Niagara College. They used the Waterhub for an assignment involving data dashboard creation, so they learned more about freshwater data while enhancing their analytical skills, and created some great data visualizations using data from the hub. And so these are just a few examples. We know that data from the hub is being used by consultants, local governments, First Nations, academia, and other stewardship groups to inform their research, operations, and decision making. As we continue to post more data and share the Waterhub with more users, these use cases continue to develop, which is so exciting to see. And we'd love to hear from our users as well. If you're using data off the hub, we'd love to hear about it. A question that we often get here is, where do I put my data? We know that the Water Hub is not the only database that exists in the Columbia Basin. I think the previous presentation highlighted at least 5 different databases available here in the region. There's also, there are federal databases, provincial databases. We recently saw the launch of Pacific Data Stream, which is focused on water quality. And we believe that there is space for all of these systems and that each can have a role to play in our collective work. Each of these databases has its own purpose, as well as its own strengths and limitations. So it can be difficult to know which is the best fit for your data, but in our opinion, the most important thing is that the data is shared somewhere, and the best solution may be different from one organization to the next. We do see a lot of benefit in a regional scale database like the Columbia Basin Waterhub, which was custom built to address specific community concerns and priorities, as well as to provide a space for our local water stewardship community to gather and collaborate. With a regional database, if those fair data principles are adhered to, broader scale data accessibility is still an option, as data can be harvested and integrated with other data portals and systems. As an example of that, we've recently collaborated with DataStream to establish a pipeline between the Elk River Alliance's Waterhub account and the new Pacific DataStream portal. So data that ERA uploads to the Waterhub also appears in DataStream, and this is a service that we aim to offer to all of our users in the future. So lots of different options for sharing data, but our call to action here is clear. Let's all continue to champion open data and collaborate across sectors to protect fresh water. So I invite you all to visit the Water Hub if you haven't already. There are some great resources there for the Elk Valley. We're always happy to help people out as well to find what they're looking for. And do reach out if you have data that you'd like to contribute to the Water Hub. We're able to host any type of water-related information, whether that be numerical data, reports, site photos, even audio or visual recordings. We can also provide links or build integrations if you've already got your data shared somewhere else and want to increase its findability and discoverability. So thank you so much for having us join you today, and a special thank you as well to all of our data contributors and users. And don't hesitate to reach out if you'd like to learn more about the Water Hub or our other programs here at Living Lakes.